Hello, and welcome back to Untold Wealth, where we discuss topics about economics and wealth untold. I am Vince,
And I'm Devon.
and we're here to bring you another episode of the Untold Wealth podcast. Hope you are sticking around, because this is going to be a very interesting one. We are going to discuss supply chains, and specifically, do you remember the title of this episode?
Yes. Can I say it? Am I allowed to? I
Please do.
I take full credit. And for those of you who don't know how it works, basically Vince and I sit down in a room and we discuss titles. And then we both go home, we research the title in our own unique flavor, and then we both come together, not knowing what each other have researched, and then we speak about it. We have an interesting discussion. And I claim full credit for this title. It is
As you should.
I keep my supply chained and not free like a hoodlum. I was very proud of that one. I was very proud of that, and I'm
I
very
think this is my
keen.
favorite so far.
It's up there, and I think we're gonna have we're gonna have more to come with some unique titles. But I think
Yeah,
it very much left it open for interpretation. So I'm extremely
absolutely.
excited for where you're gonna take it.
I think this is one episode where it's very unlikely that we're going to be discussing the same thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, let's hop right into it. Like when I thought of supply chains, obviously there's a lot of meat on that bone that I could talk about. Like just an overview of what supply chains are, and on even on like a global scale, it's kind of insane to comprehend. Like the logistics that the components of everything you own, from your cell phone to your sandwich, like needs to travel halfway across the globe in most cases just to arrive at your local supermarket or store or whatever. Like for cell phones, for example, just like the process of taking raw materials like from Africa, transporting them across the world to, let's say, Indonesia to be manufactured, and then taking those to China and India and combining them together to then be transported again halfway across the world just broke my brain.
It's a modern marvel, really.
Absolutely. But like while I was having trouble pinning down what I wanted to speak about, I came across, surprise, surprise, a quote that kind of stirred some sort of
Dude,
feelings
you're a
within me.
you're a quote guy. I haven't brought a quote to a single episode yet. You've come up with like five. Okay, I gotta bring a quote to the next episode.
I think quotes are a good way to kind of like hook. Like I know it's very like grade seven oral kind of to start your speech with a quote, but there's some really good
But
ones.
it works.
Uh,
There's a reason.
yeah, this one is very evocative, and I'll probably keep you in suspense a little bit longer. But it says, "To accomplish great things, we must not only act but also dream, not only plan but also believe." And it was by a guy named Ferdinand Lepes, de Lepes. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it quite correctly, but that's okay because this guy was kind of an asshole, to be
Oh,
entirely honest with
okay.
you.
Oh.
And he was talking about, drumroll, the Suez Canal.
Ah, very nice.
That's exactly what I'll be chatting about today. The Suez Canal, the large waterway canal that kind of connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. It kind of cuts the African continent, uh, separates it from Asia and Eurasia, and is a one of the most important trade routes in the world.
I think it
Now,
I think it is the largest like canal trade routes. I know there's another one that's very large. I just can't remember where or what it's
there's also
called.
the Panama Canal, which is also
Yes,
very
I'm thinking of the
important.
Panama Canal. That's definitely what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
I'm
Um,
not sure which one is like more integral for trade, but they're both very, very important,
hmm.
as you'll soon see. Um, but yeah, you and our listeners have probably heard a little bit about the Suez Canal when one of the trade ships that was passing through it, the Ever Given, got stuck in March of 2021. But before we'll be chatting about that and the effect that that had on the global supply chain and logistics, I wanted to chat about how exactly this very prominent trade route came to exist. explore a little bit of the history behind it.
Very
Now,
nice.
before this waterway, obviously trading between Europe and Asia was a lot more difficult. For example, Middle Eastern traders, they did something fairly clever but kind of inefficient, where they would sail up the Red Sea, and then once they got to that end point, they would unpack all their cargo, and then using camels, just go 100 kilometers west until they reached the River Nile, and then just sail up into the Mediterranean from there.
Mm.
But probably the most efficient or most known about trade route was sailing around the southern tip of Africa. That's how a lot of European settlers and traders basically came and traded with South and East Asia. And obviously we know that that southern tip of Africa became quite a central hub and pit stop that was colonized by the Dutch and then later the British, and was extremely, extremely important. But even around that space of time when that was being used, there were these ideas of how could we just cut through and reach the Asian subcontinent without having to sail all the way around. And before we chat about Ferdinand de Lépez, there were quite a few other individuals who thought about creating this canal, one of which being Napoleon. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, who's that?
Napoleon Bonaparte. Yeah, he actually really liked the idea of the canal, but at the time, for whatever reason, they believed that the Red Sea was a little bit higher in altitude than the Mediterranean. So they thought about needing to put water locks or whatever. The project ended up being way too costly for them to undertake. And around that time as well.
That's pretty interesting. So they thought of the idea, but they were like, no, altitude differences will actually make that impossible. You can't have one leading to the other, essentially. And
yeah,
okay,
implementing water locks as well would have, those weren't necessary, but the preliminary research, and it was not very easy to get down there in those times. But yeah, it was kind of thrown around a couple times, but the political landscape or the infrastructural costs to create such a thing were always overwhelmingly so. But cutting to around the 1850s or so, this French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lépez came to the newly blossoming Egyptian government, which was formerly the Ottoman Empire, to propose this idea of a Suez Canal. And surprise, surprise, the Egyptian government loved it, and they created the Suez Canal Company. The idea was, such as with any company, that nations and companies could have stocks and shares within the Suez Canal Company, Egypt as a country being one of them. And Egypt provided the manpower, I suppose, to dig out this canal. And this is where de Lépez kind of is not too great of a spokesperson to center, because he used these Egyptian workers as indentured slaves, essentially. He didn't give them any water. They worked in the hot baking sun, and unfortunately hundreds, if not thousands of people died.
All right.
When the new Egyptian government... Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, not a real great guy. Yeah.
Not a real great guy, though. The new Egyptian government, after this previous one, kind of stepped in and kind of proposed rather a real team effort to excavate this Suez Canal. And they excavated about 74 million cubic meters of dirt to get this done, which quite coincidentally in my research is the same amount of concrete placed to bring about the Qingdao Gulf Bridge in China, which is long enough to kind of straddle the English Channel. To put into some perspective.
That much concrete.
That much concrete. And once it was built, you can imagine that this waterway was very important. In the initial year that it was in service. It actually wasn't very profitable, but soon kind of word spread, I imagine. And it became this real center point for the supply chain of getting goods from Asia to Europe and vice versa. So much so that it became the central point during wars to take over. Hitler, for example, during World War II, wanted to grab the Suez Canal and take it over during his reign as Führer. However, the British and other allies kind of repelled those forces. And kind of middling down towards where we are today, at some point, the Suez Canal Company kind of got dissolved, and Egypt claimed sole ownership of it. However, this was contended a little bit. There was a whole war, but we're unfortunately going to have to skip over that to actually talk about the economics of things.
It was just a whole war, like, over a canal.
Yeah. And in the more contemporary setting today, the Suez Canal makes up about 30% of the Egyptian economy, which is crazy.
30%?
30%.
Jesus.
And that obviously comes from the tariffs that ships have to pay to, gain passage through the canal. And yeah, about 50 ships per day go through the Suez Canal. These large, megalithic vehicles that carry so much of the goods. However, while this is still cheaper than going around Africa, if you look at it from a macro perspective, the US at one point or another was still kind of unhappy by the fact that Egypt controlled this. And in the 1960s, they even debated placing about 520 nuclear bombs on Israeli soil to just blow up a new canal. But obviously that didn't come to fruition, because that's a terrible idea. But ever since, the Suez Canal has grown and grown to be one of the premier and biggest shipping routes in the world. It's estimated that, like, if you look around you, nearly 30% of all items, all goods, have passed through the Suez Canal at one point or another, whether it's the components to make them or the final good itself.
Wow. That's quite scary. I mean, I just went to a wine farm today, and I'm just trying to think, like, what components of this bottle of wine might pass through the Suez Canal. But maybe that's just a terrible example, because it's quite a South
I mean,
African
if you break
thing.
things down, I'm sure you might find something. Either be the fertilizer or like the wood. I'm not too sure.
No, absolutely.
But
yeah,
it's extremely important. Obviously, important resources as well get moved through and from, since it's around the Middle Eastern area. Petroleum is one of the big resources that move to Europe and through other parts of Africa. And as you can imagine, having such a vital trade route disrupted in any way will have very, very heavy ramifications. And so we come to that fateful day on the 23rd of March in 2021, where the Ever Given was kind of taking route from Malaysia, heading towards the Netherlands, and during the early hours of the morning, it kind of went into a sandstorm, and strong winds pushed the front of the ship to the point where it got lodged in to the actual canal itself. And it was stuck there for a total of 6 days.
Is that the official story? Because, I mean, yeah, I had actually completely forgotten about that. Embarrassingly enough, I didn't even think about that as a topic for this video, so I'm so glad you brought it up. But that became headline news across the world, right? Everyone, if you hadn't heard of the Suez Canal, you'd hear about it now, because your favorite toy wasn't getting shipped to you from wherever in the world you were usually getting it from. But I just remember there being so many conspiracy theories around, was it a sandstorm? How did it get lodged? There's apparently a lot of bribery that happens with captains and such. Maybe they did it on purpose because they weren't receiving their bribes on time or something like that. Did you happen to research anything like that, or was that just plain conspiracy theories from university students being passed around?
I mean, there might be some validity to it, because I do know that the US does get kind of preferential treatment when they arrive at like the front of the canal. They can essentially skip the queue as well because of possibly some relations between Egypt and America and maybe some donations perchance
Yeah, yeah.
through there.
Relations or donations? That's the real question.
Yeah. But like reading into it, it's very difficult to like attribute any given ship to a single like company or single nation. Because like if you look at the Ever Given, for example, there's like it's registered in Panama. It's owned by like a different company that's halfway across the world. Then it's like the labor is like Indian nationals. It had a German captain, and then like it's insured by an entirely different company. So like one ship is this conglomerate of all different types of companies and insurers and nations.
Not to mention,
So it's very difficult.
Yeah, the goods on the ship as well. I mean, like it's
Yeah,
definitely-
absolutely. So if it was a conspiracy, then there's a lot of
There's a lot of room for it, is what you're saying.
yeah, and also probably like a lot of like friendly fire as well, with how many countries and nations are kind of attributed to one ship itself. But nevertheless, conspiracy or no, it got stuck, and it was blocked off for a total of 6 days, which, as you can imagine, just describing how much of an influence it has, is an enormous kick to the global supply chain. For example, for the duration of the blockage, those 6 days, over 300 vessels were blocked from continuing their journey, which some studies attribute to about 12% of world trade around that space of time.
Wow.
So if you look around, every 10th thing would just be gone.
Scary.
These ships had everything from cattle to crude oil, and obviously, even during the pandemic, this caused the price of gas, for example, in America, to rise by 40 cents. But if we quantify everything that happened into monetary terms, the blockage is estimated to have caused $9 billion worth of loss of goods each day that it was stuck.
9 billion. I'm trying to think of a country that has about that kind of GDP, because you're essentially it's 6 days of that. So what's that? 9 times 6, 36. So that's $36 billion lost in terms of trade, because one ship decided to do a little bit of a drift across the across the canal.
Essentially.
Wow.
Although, speaking of that figure, like it's estimated to be about 400 million each hour, which is also fairly mind-blowing. Like I can't imagine like being part of that process of getting the ship out of the canal.
Yeah, why
and
did it take
realizing
so
that
long? Like I can't remember.
the issue, I think, was that it's such a big ship, and once it gets stuck, you have a lot of things you need to do in order to like get it unstuck. You need to push and pull at each side of it. You need to like clear out the dirt and sand so that it doesn't like remain stuck. It's nasty business.
Oh, yeah, but continue. I think you're speaking about a worker trying to get it out.
Well, I was just thinking, like, if you're one of the workers or companies trying to get this ship out, and you know that every single hour that you like work, the entire world is losing about like $400 million. That the pressure, I imagine, is intense. But speaking of, interestingly, the figures that I saw, adding up all the losses for that 6-day period, they estimate that it's around 54 billion in trade loss rather than that 36.
So, yeah.
But they also mention that the actual costs are probably a lot higher when you consider the knock-on effects. For example, the ships that were waiting, obviously that delay doesn't just clear up as soon as the Suez Canal is still like able to be passed through. The delay itself needs time to kind of even out once more. And some experts predict that it'll take about months, if not years, for things to kind of go back to what they would have been had it not been stuck.
It's quite terrifying to think about. I mean, there's probably thousands of companies making individual decisions to, stop trade or, decrease their output on products, how they're routing it. They
Absolutely.
reran all their calculations. Some probably decided to close up shop because they had uh, let's imagine they had a big shipment that had to get through, and that's how they made their money for that year. And, it didn't, or it didn't make them as much profit as it should have. I can imagine that being for sure the case for a lot of companies around the world. So it's impossible. You could try and measure that kind of stuff, but you won't really know it until you see the knock-on effects years later. So I can only
Yeah.
imagine.
Hindsight is unfortunately the only view that we can take in economics here.
Mm.
But doubling down on the fact that it disrupted supply chains. This was also happening during the pandemic, which already had its supply chain issues. So it was a real just salt in the wound, kick in the groin, on top of an already terrible time for supply chains and logistics. But maybe a little bit naively, uh, my takeaway from this was actually one of like I was feeling impressed that how robust the supply chain, like the global supply chain, actually is. Because reading about this, like, it's a lot of money, and I'm sure a lot of things went wrong. But I'm still very impressed by the fact that, like, it wasn't worse, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And researching it more, like, there were. This isn't the first time that this has happened. In 2004 and in 2007, ships also got stuck in the Suez Canal for, I think it was 3 days for one of them. Um, so it's very impressive that we have this like lifeblood, these veins that fuel our economy. And even if one of them gets blocked or something happens to it, there's still a lot of robustness within it. This complex system manages to kind of stay put, even if it's knocked down a bit.
Yeah. So what I take away from that is essentially that hindsight, right? I
Mm.
want to come back to hindsight because my little anecdote and story actually has is quite a fundamental hindsight bias to how you interpret it
Okay.
afterwards, but also that it's money. When there's that much money at stake, these companies have to have a plan A, B, C, and D. They have to have different ports and different shipping manifests, and they have to have different
Yeah.
ways of getting their goods around. Um, and I would love to see like a time lapse of shipping routes as soon as it closes and seeing how the different veins and the shipping routes get used more around the world. I've seen similar things when an airport shuts down or like air traffic around the country grinds to a halt, right? You basically see all these planes leave, that were leaving and coming and going, like it just grinds to a halt. So I imagine something very similar happened with the canal when it shut down. You see all different veins that haven't been used in ages across the world, kind of glowing with much more traffic than is usual.
Yeah, there's actually a great site that I checked out fairly early on in my research that really was one of the reasons that my brain was so broken. It's called shipmap.org, and it basically shows you all the ships throughout some span of time that navigate the world and go from one place to another. And you very much see like these set shipping routes that are almost like veins around the world. It's really fascinating. I recommend you and our listeners as well go
I
check it out.
I just checked it out. This is insane. It's very true. It does look really cool. It's exactly what I was envisioning. Shipmap.org, if you guys were wondering what I was trying to describe, this is exactly it. And there's the canal right there. Wow. Um, awesome. Vince, thank you very much, man. I'm honestly embarrassed that I didn't even think about that. When I mean, before Vince and I hopped on the podcast, we were just chatting about, how the research went, catching up with each other, and we both came to the conclusion that it was really hard to research this topic.
It's
Essentially,
very broad.
yeah, it's very broad, and it's hard to write a story about something as kind of boring as a supply chain not working. You know, like obviously the Suez Canal is a bit of an extreme example, but essentially a supply chain is a lot of individual nodes all working concurrently, all getting profit and making things go in one direction, right? So when something like that fails, there's not like one big story. It's always just like, oh, one of those nodes fails, nodes reroute around each other and they find a way.
Yes.
So it's kind of hard to find something very interesting, but I did find something really interesting, and it has.
I'm so excited.
It's a cool story. So I'm going to be telling you about this story, and you might be like, "Oh, Devon, this has nothing to do with supply chains," and to a certain extent, I'm actually fully on board. I kind of got lost in the story as well, to be honest. It doesn't have the most to do with supply chains, but it has a cool little snippet at the end. When I was chatting about hindsight earlier. All right, so cast your mind back to the late 16th century. All right,
Okay.
specifically around it was a Spanish-Dutch war. Essentially, I can't remember. It was like the 80s war, something like that. The long 80s war. I can't quite remember. It's essentially the Spanish trying to quell a Dutch rebellion in some of their lands, revolt and things like that. But specifically, the story revolves around the town of Antwerp. All right, Antwerp was a bustling city of trade and finance, but in 1577, I believe, it was sacked by the Spanish. All right, they actually were in it. They sacked it, and then they left it for the Dutch, and that royally pissed off the Dutch. It in fact almost sparked a revolution of the Dutch that were kind of in the Netherlands, but it was, under control by the Spanish at that time.
I'm not surprised.
So
That would piss me
they got
off.
handed the city. It was sacked, and they said, no, this will be the city to start a revolution. Okay. 5 years later, when the Spaniards had finished their conquest somewhere around the world, honestly, the details don't matter, they come back and say, hey, Antwerp's actually kind of thriving over there. We want it back. And obviously the Dutch didn't want that to happen. All right, but this posed a problem for the Spanish because it was quite a fort. It was not an easy city to conquer. So quite brilliantly, one of the Spanish commanders decided that, hey, the best way to take Antwerp is to starve Antwerp, to cut off their supplies and effectively siege Antwerp. It's
Classic siege.
in history, it's called the Siege of Antwerp. And obviously that makes sense, right? You've heard of sieges before. An army settles around a castle and they say no one steps in and out. Raise your white flag when you want to surrender, and we'll be done with it. But
Sieges were kind of like cheat codes in medieval warfare, I think.
yeah, they were. The castles and stuff, and even Antwerp, they knew that a siege might take place in the future, so they actually had legislated. Well, I'm not too sure if they legislated, but the mayor at the time, I think his name was Philip, something like that. He had actually stated that people must keep 2 years worth of rations on them at any point of time because a siege might be very likely, and he was correct. There was a bit of
What a forward thinker.
yeah, he was quite smart actually. But apparently there was some debacle about the nobles not keeping as much as they were supposed to because they kind of feel they get shafted in times of needs if they keep more food than the plebeians below. But that doesn't really matter. But what makes the siege very, very interesting is that firstly the Spanish set up one of the most widely regarded supply routes in all of history called the Spanish Road across a number of their territories. But the Spanish Road is actually not the most interesting part about this entire story. So they're sieging Antwerp. They've circled around it with troops. But the only thing they haven't done to complete the siege is stopped its water transportation, because half of it was, on land, half of it was supposedly by the lake, or rather the river called, trying to remember its name, the Scheldt River. There we go, the Scheldt River. Okay.
So these are like boats that they had on store and also in the waterways.
Yes, exactly. So that's the only way they hadn't stop the siege at that point. They hadn't quite sieged the waterway. So what the Spaniards did is they tried to capture all the forts along the waterway, but weren't successful in capturing all of them. So they said, okay, new plan. And they built a 750-meter bridge across this river channel and said, absolutely not. No Dutch vessels will be coming through here. They stationed cannons across the forts. They did have cannons across the riverbanks, not quite on the bridge, because it wasn't like a concrete or stone bridge. It was very much a lumber. Not haphazardly built. There was a lot of carpenters. In fact, they cited 100 carpenters who were involved in creating the bridge. But it wasn't like a fort. It was just, a proper solid bridge.
A toll gate.
Yeah, it was a toll gate, essentially. And they said, you will not be getting supplies from the ocean. And this worked to a certain extent. There were a lot of offensives from the Dutch to retake forts that the Spanish had taken from them and to break down this bridge because they needed food. But all of them kind of didn't work. Funny part is that one of them did. All right. This is called the attack on the Palmer's Bridge. This was nicknamed Palmer's Bridge because Palmer was the Spanish general or commander at the time who had the great idea of creating the bridge. What they did is they loaded two not so small vessels, but not large vessels, stacked them with gunpowder, and they pretty much had the intention of completely demolishing the bridge. They launched two of these vessels, and apparently there was quite an intricate mechanism to when to detonate it and timers of when it would. So it was a well thought out plan, and it actually did work. One ship didn't quite make it. The Spaniards had these smaller rowing boats that they actually fixed masts to ram into ships that were trying to break the bridge down. But one of these gunpowder dinghies, I suppose, did make it to the bridge and blew the hell out of it. Apparently 800 Spanish soldiers died. It completely decimated this bridge.
That's a successful mission.
It was successful, right? Apparently it was so disturbing. It was so disturbing to the Dutch reconnaissance team to figure out if they'd actually blown up the bridge and could they finally signal to reinforcements from upriver to bring them supplies. But they were so horrified they couldn't even get close to the bridge because of the number of bodies and sheer destruction they saw all around. So
that's crazy.
So they couldn't even launch the signal rocket up into the air to launch a call for aid, because they were too scared. That is literally what what it is cited as. They were too scared to confirm if the bridge was destroyed or not. That is how destructive this explosion was.
This is like the 16th century version of seeing like a nuke in modern day. Just massive explosion, bodies flying everywhere.
Yeah.
You don't know what to expect.
I'm sure this river was just full of blood and limbs everywhere. I mean, the Spanish must have been very pissed off. And, the Dutch didn't even know they were successful, which is the craziest part. So what Palmer did is, 2 or 3 days later, he figured like, oh, there's not ships coming through this bridge anymore. Like, why aren't the Dutch? They blew up the bridge. Like, why aren't these ships coming through? He eventually figured out they must have some kind of communication problem. So he says, we have to quickly rebuild this bridge. So they did. They quickly did rebuild it, but it does make mention that it was very much not up to the standards of the previous bridge. It was very much, smoke and mirrors. It was just there for show. It actually was not going to do much containment if some kind of large barge kind of wanted to break through it. But it did the job. It held the siege. An interesting fact that I forgot to mention earlier is that the Dutch, in an attempt to starve the Spanish who were besieging them, flooded the plains around Antwerp as well. So Antwerp was honestly chaos. So the Spanish siegers were having trouble getting their supplies, even utilizing the Spanish road that I mentioned earlier to bring supplies to themselves. And the Dutch were in the city, and essentially the only thing the Dutch were using to survive was their rations that they had stored in their city, and smugglers. Okay, and
Good time to be a smuggler.
good time to be a smuggler, right? You were making a lot of money, primarily on bringing grain and bread into the city. However, Philip was not happy because the smugglers were gouging the hell out of the bread and grain they were bringing into the city. And he eventually put a price ceiling on the price of bread and grain. For those of you who don't know what a price ceiling is the maximum amount a good set by the state that a good is allowed to be sold for. Conversely, there's such thing as a price floor, which is the minimum amount a good is supposed to be priced for. So Philip,
What a novel concept.
yeah, he announced a price ceiling on the price of grain. However, this is thought of as the biggest blunder in the siege of Antwerp because in the laws of supply and demand, there was a lot of demand for bread in Antwerp. People were starving. People were willing to pay the gouging rates. There was still bread and grain coming into the city. However, when the smugglers, could not charge exorbitant amounts for their bread, they just wouldn't bring any bread into the city. It wasn't worth the risk of their life smuggling, through these trade routes and through the marshes around the city and things like that. So the siege of Antwerp essentially ended in a success for the French. They besieged it successfully, but it was well categorized that the French were I say French, I mean Spanish. Sorry, that the Spanish were also very close to running out of food. In fact, they reckon that a good 1 or 2 months, and the Spaniards would have actually abandoned the siege because they also were being, mired by Dutch, convoys and ambushes and things like that with their supply routes. So
for a second there, I thought you were like, and then the French showed up.
Sorry.
Decided to siege the Spanish.
No. Very much the Spanish Inquisition, the biggest surprise of them all. So yeah, that was kind of that was the siege of Antwerp, and I thought that was very interesting. It was a mayor, Philip, a burgermeester in Dutch or Afrikaans, very much trying to protect his citizens from being gouged. He was trying to get them fed, but ended up having the converse effect. And I thought that was the most interesting part. Forget about the bridge and the Spanish road. I found that very interesting. That this guy was just trying to help his citizens, but couldn't quite understand that the best way to help them was to actually just keep this inflow of food in, no matter the cost, essentially.
The invisible hand had to do its job.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it must have been hard for him, though. Could you imagine? I mean, citizens suffering, they're paying absorbent amounts for a slice of bread. He just puts his foot down. And probably the price was probably still high. He probably set a very high price ceiling, but smugglers do not risk their lives for price ceilings. They risk their lives for as much as they can get out of a certain situation.
And yeah, they shouldn't. I mean, the idea of sieging any Dutch city to me is like quite a interesting idea, because from what I know, the Netherlands is very, very flat. So when you siege them, it's they have that nuclear option of like, these dams that we've built to keep our city from sinking under the ocean. Yeah, we don't need those anymore.
Yeah.
And suddenly everything becomes half a swamp.
Yeah.
But damn, I mean, sieges, I guess, were the very medieval classical way of like, here you have a supply chain. Let's throw a wrench in there.
Let's
stop everything. And I think it's a good indication of how important they were, not even to just medieval cities, but today. However, I think, yeah, like comparing and contrasting the history of it to today, like it's very obvious that the supply chains we have now are far more robust. Like, as you mentioned, there is a plan C, plan B, plan D of what you can do if something goes awry. And those nodes kind of connecting to other ones that I think is one of the big perks of living in a time. Like I can have a kiwi from mainland China just at the store. And the reason that it's here is because there's demand here and they have the supply, and the supply chain does the work in between.
The most remarkable part is that the supply chain isn't so expensive as to completely not allow it to be sold halfway across the world or completely across the world. I think that's
That is crazy.
remarkable as well. I mean, everyone's taking their pinch of the pie, and there's still enough for a consumer to say, I still want to purchase that, even with those added costs of the supply management and stuff.
Yeah, one of the like very first thoughts of like what can I chat about with regards to the supply chain was like taking a object that we all use or eat, and I think I was thinking of doing it in a sandwich and be like, okay, there's the bread, there's the lettuce, there's the meat, there's the tomatoes, there's the sauce or whatever. Like if I broke that down and like traced them all to their sources, like how far away would they all be from each other, starting off at the farms and at the like how they all come together. That would also be a very interesting like way of dissecting the supply chain of how everything just kind of merges and then is at an affordable price able to be purchased by you.
Mm. That would be hard to do though. Like
Yeah,
I can understand if you why you didn't do that, because that does sound like quite a mission. You pick a peanut butter
I,
brand and then you just run with it. Like, where
exactly.
are you getting produced? Where are your farms located? Okay. What supply routes do you use?
I think as well, you mentioned with the wine farms, like most of that stuff probably would be sourced locally, regardless as well, just because it's cheaper. But for something like a cell phone, where you have precious metals that are only found in Rwanda and then taken to Thailand to be manufactured into a processor that is taken to China to be like made into an iPhone, for example, and then distributed worldwide. Like that is an example that I saw of like how a global supply chain works that breaks my brain.
Well, all right, Vincent. I very much enjoyed that. I honestly learnt a lot. Thank you very much. Some key takeaways, I think. Just realizing how interconnected this world is it's scary, but it helps us in the end. And just knowing that there's all these forces happening in the background just to put a slice of bread on your plates is alarming, but also comforting in a way. It makes sure that you're not going to starve through the next winter. There's not going to be a siege of Antwerp in the 21st century or century, hopefully. But yeah, that pretty much does it for the third episode of the Untold Wealth podcast.
I do have one more
Oh,
question.
you do? Let's go for it. Let's go for it.
Is your supply chained or are you a hoodlum?
I'm very much a supply chain enjoyer. I think supply chains are far too unruly to be free. You can't leave it up to smugglers. They will gouge you. You have to do your best to make sure you're setting, efficient market prices for your goods that are coming into your city.
I love it.
And conversely, back to you. What's your take on? What's your take on the same question?
Yeah, I like my supply extremely chained. As many chains as
Oh
possible.
wow! All right.
Strong links, good titanium alloy. I don't know, but I'm big supply chain enjoyer for sure.
Well, all right. That says it. That's conclusive. And guys, thank you very much for watching or listening to the podcast. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment on whatever you're watching this on, and we'll see you in the next one. See ya.
See ya.